For every woman who fell for the wrong man in the right moment, the most dangerous thing in the world is a man who has nothing left to lose, except you. The letter arrived on a Tuesday. Caterina Bellini had always believed that terrible things happened on Tuesdays. Her grandmother used to say it too, that Tuesdays were the days the devil did his paperwork, filed his complaints, sent his correspondence in crisp white envelopes with no return address. And so, when she found the envelope wedged between the gas bill and a flyer for a mattress sale, she already felt the specific chill that had nothing to do with the October air pushing through the cracked kitchen window. She set it on the counter. She made coffee. She stood at the stove in her mother's apron, red-checked, flour-dusted, permanently stained with 30 years of tomato sauce. And she watched the envelope the way you watch a spider you're not sure is dead. The kitchen smelled the way it always smelled, garlic and olive oil and the ghost of last night's oregano. Through the pass-through window, she could see the dining room of Bellini's, still dim in the early morning light, chairs upturned on tables, the old pendant lamps hanging low over the red-clothed tables like sleeping lanterns. 22 tables. She'd counted them 1,000 times. She knew the nick in the fourth chair at table 7, the slight lean of the bar that her father had always meant to fix but never did. The way the afternoon sun came through the west window and lit up the dust motes and made the whole room look like something from a painting. She'd grown up in this room. She'd done her homework at the corner table. She'd had her first kiss in the alley behind the kitchen, with Marco Ferraro, who smelled like dish soap and ambition. She'd cried in the walk-in freezer when her father died, because it was the only place in the building where no one could hear you fall apart. She opened the envelope. Dear Ms. Bellini, this letter serves as formal notice that the property located at 247 Mulberry Street, New York, NY 10012, along with the associated business assets and lease agreements, has been acquired by Falcone Holdings, LLC, effective October 15th. As the new property owner, Falcone Holdings, LLC requests a meeting at your earliest convenience to discuss the terms of transition. Please be advised that the current lease agreement will not be renewed upon its expiration on December 31st of this year. Regards, R. Marchetti, Legal Counsel, Falcone Holdings, LLC. Caterina read it twice. Then she set it very carefully on the counter, went to the window, and looked out at Mulberry Street in the gray Tuesday morning, where a delivery truck was double parked and someone was already arguing about it, and the bodega on the corner was opening its accordion gates, and old Mr. Giannotti was walking his arthritic beagle in the slow, dignified way of men who have nowhere to be and are grateful for it. She'd known it was coming. Intellectually, she'd known. The building had been sold 3 months ago to a holding company. She'd been notified then, told not to worry, that everything would remain as is. Her mother had believed that. Her Uncle Sal had believed that. Caterina had not believed it for a single second. But she had let herself be carried along by their optimism, because the alternative, planning for the end, felt like giving up. She turned back to the letter. Falcone Holdings. She knew the name. Everyone in Little Italy knew the name, though knowing it and saying it were different things. You knew it the way you knew certain other things. The weight of a silence in a room when someone important walked in. The particular quality of a smile that never reached the eyes. The Falcone family had been in New York for 40 years, and in that time they had moved from the old ways, the docks, the numbers, the protection rackets that her own grandfather had paid into without comment, into the new ways. Real estate, development, holdings companies with clean letterhead and lawyers who wore suits that cost more than her monthly rent. They were legitimate now. That was what people said. The Falcones are legitimate now. Nobody said it like they believed it. She picked up her phone and called her Uncle Sal. Sal Bellini arrived 20 minutes later, still in his undershirt, breathing hard from the stairs, which he always took too fast, even though Dr. Martinelli had told him twice about his blood pressure. He was 61 years old, thick through the chest the way their father had been thick, with the same dark eyes and the same habit of going very still when he was angry, like a man conserving energy for the explosion. He read the letter standing up. Then he sat down heavily in one of the kitchen chairs. Falcone, he said. Yes. Nero Falcone? The letter just says Falcone Holdings. Sal set the letter on the table and looked at it as if it might change. He's been buying up half of Little Italy for 2 years. The old Russo building on Grand. The apartment block on Hester. I heard he was looking at this block, but I thought—" He stopped. "You thought what?" "I thought your father's name meant something." He said it quietly, without bitterness, which was somehow worse than if he'd been angry. "Your father and old Marco Falcone shook hands once. At the feast. I thought that still meant something." "Old Marco is dead," Katerina said. "He's been dead for 4 years." "I know when he died, Katerina." She sat down across from him and folded her hands on the table, the way she did when she was trying to think clearly rather than feel. "So, the lease expires December 31st. That's 78 days. They want a meeting. Don't go." "I have to go, Zio." "You don't have to do anything they say." "I have to find out what they want. Maybe there's a negotiation. Maybe there's a new lease at a higher rent, and we find a way to make it work. Maybe—" "Nero Falcone doesn't negotiate." Sal looked at her steadily. "You know what kind of man he is." "I know what people say he is." "People aren't wrong about everything." She met her uncle's eyes and held them. The kitchen was quiet except for the radiator ticking and the distant sound of the street coming to life outside. She was 31 years old, and she had been running this restaurant since her father died 3 years ago, and she was very, very tired of being afraid of things she couldn't control. "I'll go to the meeting," she said, "and then I'll know." She called the number on the letterhead that afternoon, standing at the bar with the lunch rush just beginning to fill the dining room. The construction workers from the NYU site on Spring Street, the regulars who came for the weekday pasta special, the 2 Columbia professors who always sat at table 4 and argued about things Katerina couldn't follow but enjoyed overhearing. A woman answered, smooth, professional, the kind of voice trained to reveal nothing. The meeting was scheduled for Friday, 10 a.m., at an address on Park Avenue. Park Avenue, of course. She hung up and turned back to the dining room, where old Mr. Gennady had come in and was already seated at his usual table by the window, unfolding his newspaper with the ceremony of a man who takes small pleasures seriously. "Katerina," he called, not looking up. "The carbonara today?" "The carbonara today," she confirmed. He nodded with satisfaction. She tied her apron and went back to work. That night, after closing, after the last of the staff had gone home and the dishwasher had run its final cycle, and the chairs were up on the tables and the lights were low, she sat at the bar with a glass of her father's Barolo, and she let herself feel it. The grief wasn't new. It had been 3 years since her father died. A heart attack, sudden, on a Wednesday morning. Wednesdays were neutral. The devil didn't do paperwork on Wednesdays, just administrative follow-up. But it pooled in her chest now with a particular weight. He'd built this place. He'd come over from Salerno at 22 with $300 and a recipe for Sunday gravy that his mother had made him memorize and never write down. And he had built this restaurant out of nothing, out of sheer mule-headed stubbornness and charm. And for 30 years it had fed people and made people happy and meant something in this neighborhood. And now a man named Nero Falcone, who probably ate at restaurants that had Michelin stars and wine lists that required a sommelier, was going to take it. She poured a second glass. She was not going to let that happen without a fight. She didn't know yet what that fight looked like, or whether she could win it. She just knew that she was Domenico Bellini's daughter, and Domenico Bellini's daughters did not fold quietly. She raised her glass in the dim room. "For you, Papa," she said softly. The restaurant said nothing back, but she felt its answer anyway, in the creak of the floorboards and the smell of the walls and the weight of 30 years of meals and laughter and ordinary, extraordinary life. She drank. The Falcone Holdings offices occupied the 42nd and 43rd floors of a building on Park Avenue that had the particular coldness of places designed to impress rather than welcome. The lobby was marble and glass and intentional silence, the kind of silence that cost money to maintain. The security desk was staffed by 2 men who wore their suits the way soldiers wore uniforms, not for comfort, but for function. Katerina wore her good coat. It was navy blue, wool, bought 3 years ago at Bloomingdale's during a sale, and it was the finest thing she owned, and she was aware of that in a way she usually managed not to be. She'd put her hair up, dark, thick, the kind of hair that had a will of its own and generally won. And she was wearing the small gold earrings her mother had given her, and the watch her father had left her, which was a decent watch, but not a watch. Not the kind of watch the woman at the security desk was wearing. She gave her name. She was expected. She was taken up in an elevator that moved so smoothly it felt like standing still while the world fell away beneath you. A young man in a dark suit met her on the 42nd floor and led her through a corridor that was all cream and charcoal, low light and deep carpet, the occasional piece of art on the wall that looked expensive in the specific way of things bought by people who don't particularly love art but understand that art is a form of speech. He showed her into a conference room and said that Mr. Falcone would be with her shortly, and offered her water or coffee, and she asked for coffee because she needed something to do with her hands. She sat at the long table and looked out at the city. From 42 floors up, Manhattan had a different quality. The noise was gone, the grit was gone, the whole sweating organism of it was rendered abstract and beautiful. She could see Central Park, brown gold with October. She could see the silver thread of the Hudson far to the west. It was, she admitted to herself reluctantly, a magnificent view. She was studying a building she thought might be the Empire State when the door opened. She'd looked him up, of course. She'd found photographs, at charity events, at real estate announcements, once in the background of a society page photo from a gala. In the photographs, he looked like what he was, handsome in a cold, deliberate way, dark-suited, watchful. But photographs, she realized the moment he walked into the room, were a fundamentally insufficient medium for Nero Falcone. He was tall, several inches over 6 feet, and he moved with the contained precision of someone who has learned to take up exactly as much space as he chooses, and not a fraction more. Dark hair, cut close, a jaw that looked like it had been carved by someone with a grudge, eyes the color of dark slate, gray-green in the conference room light, which found her immediately and did not waver. He was, she thought with unwilling clarity, extraordinarily attractive in the way that certain dangerous things were attractive, the same quality of beauty that belonged to storms and blades. He was also younger than she'd expected, 34, 35 at most. He sat down across from her without preamble, without a handshake, without the social lubricant of small talk. He had a folder in front of him. He hadn't brought anyone with him, which surprised her. She'd expected lawyers. "Ms. Bellini," he said. His voice was low and even, with the faint residue of an Italian-American accent, not the broad vowels of the neighborhood, something more controlled, like an instrument that had been tuned to hold its tone in any room. "Mr. Falcone," she said. A pause. He looked at her with an attention that was slightly unnerving, as if he was reading something in her face that she hadn't intended to put there. "I appreciate you coming," he said. "I had a choice?" The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile. "Everyone has a choice." That's a very philosophical position for a man who sent an eviction notice. Something shifted in his expression. A slight recalibration. The way a person adjusts when an encounter doesn't go the way they anticipated. He opened the folder. "The lease on your property expires December 31st, he said. "I'll be straightforward with you, Ms. Bellini. My company has plans for the Mulberry Street block. Development plans. The restaurant space is part of that." "What kind of development?" "Mixed use, residential and commercial. High end." "Little Italy doesn't need more luxury condos," she said. "What Little Italy needs is to stay Little Italy. With respect, the neighborhood's demographics have been shifting for 20 years. That's not something I'm responsible for." "No, you're just accelerating it." Another pause. He looked at her steadily, and she had the distinct sensation of being assessed, not unpleasantly, but thoroughly, in the way that a careful person looks at something they're deciding whether to keep. "I have a proposal," he said. "I assumed you did. That's why you called a meeting instead of just letting the lease expire. The building will be under renovation beginning in January. The restaurant space will be redesigned as part of the ground floor commercial component. I'm prepared to offer you a new lease in the redesigned space at a favorable rate, contingent on some changes to the restaurant's concept and presentation." She felt the hook hidden in that sentence. "What kind of changes?" "The Bellini's brand has equity in the neighborhood. I'm not proposing you close. I'm proposing you evolve. Upscale the menu, update the interior, reposition. You want to turn my father's restaurant into something for the people who move into your luxury condos? I want to turn it into something that survives, he said, and there was an edge in his voice that was not unkind, which somehow made it worse. The alternative is that the lease expires, the space is redesigned for commercial retail, and the Bellini name disappears from Mulberry Street entirely. She held his gaze. He held hers. The city floated 42 floors below them, indifferent. I need time, she said. You have until November 15th to give me your decision. That's 6 weeks. 6 weeks to decide whether to erase everything my father built. 6 weeks to decide whether you want to preserve something or lose everything. He said it without cruelty, which was almost the cruelest way to say it. Those are your options, Miss Bellini. I'm sorry they're not better ones. She stood. She picked up her bag. She looked at him across the conference table and she thought, "You don't look like a man who is sorry about anything." "Thank you for the coffee," she said, and she walked out. She cried in the elevator, briefly and quietly, between the 34th floor and the lobby. By the time the doors opened, she had stopped, and she walked through the marble lobby and through the heavy glass doors and out onto Park Avenue where the October wind hit her like a correction, and she stood on the sidewalk and breathed. 6 weeks. She began to walk south. She walked all the way back to Mulberry Street, 40 blocks, because she needed to move, and she needed to think, and she needed the city under her feet. The real city, the ground-level city, with its noise and its smell and its endless, complicated life. By the time she reached the restaurant, she had not arrived at any resolution. But she had arrived at something. The knowledge that she was not going to agree to anything without a fight, and that the fight was going to have to be creative, because she was not fighting with money or lawyers or power, and Nero Falcone had all three. What she had was a restaurant that people loved. She was going to have to figure out how to turn that into a weapon. 3 days passed. Katerina threw herself into the work the way she always did when she needed to think without thinking. In the kitchen, in the rhythm of prep and service, in the particular meditative quality of making something with her hands. She made pasta. She made a lot of pasta. She rolled it by hand the way her grandmother had taught her, pressing her weight into the dough, feeling it change under her palms, the resistance giving way to smoothness and then to silk. Her mother called every day, asking what had happened at the meeting, and every day Katerina said she was still working on it, which was true in the most minimal sense. Her Uncle Sal called twice, and she let it go to voicemail, because Sal's solution to everything was to get angry, and she couldn't afford to get angry right now. She called a lawyer. The lawyer, a woman named Diane Chen, who had gone to law school with Katerina's college roommate, and now had a small practice in Midtown, confirmed what Katerina already suspected. The lease was straightforward. The expiration was legally clean, and Falcone Holdings' position was entirely solid. There was no leverage there. She researched Falcone Holdings. She read everything she could find, the real estate filings, the development announcements, the business press. Falcone Holdings was the legitimate arm of the Falcone family's business interests, and it was run by Nero Falcone, who had taken over after his father's death 4 years ago, and had, in the years since, transformed it from a moderately successful operation into something considerably more substantial. He was, the business press noted, methodical, disciplined, and remarkably difficult to read. The profile she found in a real estate magazine quoted a competitor who said, simply, "Nero doesn't lose." On Thursday morning, a reservation appeared in the open table system for Saturday evening. Party of 2, under the name Inn Falcone, 7 p.m., requesting the corner table. Katerina stared at her laptop screen for a long moment. He was coming to the restaurant. She could refuse the reservation. She had that right. She could call the number listed and say they were fully booked, which they almost were on Saturday, but not quite, and that would be technically defensible. She accepted it. She wasn't sure why exactly. Partly it was pride. She was not going to hide from him in her own restaurant. Partly it was something more calculated. If he was coming here voluntarily, if he was bringing someone to her restaurant for dinner, then he would be on her ground for once, not his. He would be the one in the unfamiliar environment. And partly, she admitted this only to herself, in the way you admit things that don't reflect well on you. She wanted to see what he looked like in her world. Saturday came with the particular electricity of a busy service night. They were fully booked by 6 p.m. Katerina's front-of-house manager, a wiry Neapolitan named Gianni, who had worked there for 12 years, noticed her checking the reservation list 3 times in an hour and raised an eyebrow. Something special tonight? Full house, always special. Gianni, who had known her since she was 18 and had no illusions about hotels, said nothing more, but he gave her a look that catalogued several things without commenting on any of them. At 5 minutes to 7, she was in the kitchen when she heard the front door. She gave it 3 minutes. Then she told Marco, her sous chef, that she was going to check the floor, and she went through the kitchen door and out into the dining room. Nero Falcone was at the corner table. He was alone, which surprised her. She'd registered the reservation as a party of 2 and assumed he'd bring someone, a business associate, a woman, anyone. But he was alone, and he was reading the menu with the calm attention of someone who intends to take the meal seriously. He'd exchanged the dark suit for something slightly less formal, a charcoal jacket over a black shirt, open at the collar. But he wore it with the same quality she'd noticed in the conference room, as if he was always precisely where he meant to be. He looked up before she reached the table. She hadn't been quiet, but the dining room was full and noisy. And still he looked up at the exact right moment, as if he'd been aware of her approach before he could logically have been. "Ms. Bellini," he said. "Mr. Falcone." She stopped at the edge of the table. "I noticed your reservation." "I assumed you would." "You could have called." "I could have." He looked at the menu, then back at her. "I wanted to eat here." She studied him. "Why?" "Because I'm making decisions about this building and I've never eaten in the restaurant. That seemed like an oversight." It was a reasonable answer. It was also not the whole answer. She could tell that, something in the deliberateness of his phrasing. But she wasn't going to press him in the middle of a service. "Johnny will take care of you," she said. "Enjoy your dinner." She turned to go. "Ms. Bellini." She stopped, half-turned. "What do you recommend?" he asked. She looked at him for a moment. The dining room moved and breathed around them. The sound of cutlery and conversation, the smell of garlic and wine, the warm light of the pendant lamps, and he sat in the middle of it like a stone in a current, entirely still. "The Sunday gravy," she said. "My father's recipe. If you want to understand what this place is, that's where you start." He held her gaze. "Then that's what I'll have." She nodded. She went back to the kitchen. She did not look back. But she knew, with the certainty of someone who has developed a finely calibrated sense for being watched, that he watched her go. She sent the Sunday gravy herself. She also sent a small plate of bruschetta that hadn't been ordered, because the tomatoes that week were extraordinary, late season, from a farm upstate that her father had been buying from since the 90s, and she couldn't not. She watched the table from the kitchen pass-through, which she was aware was not dignified behavior, but did anyway. He ate with attention. Not the performative attention of someone trying to show they appreciate food, but the quiet focus of someone who actually does. He ate slowly. He cleaned the plate. When Gianni came back to the kitchen, he stopped next to Katerina and said, quietly, "Table 7 wants to compliment the chef. I'm busy." Gianni gave her a look. He specifically asked. His exact words were, Gianni consulted some inner archive. "Please tell Miss Bellini that I would appreciate a moment of her time, if she can spare it." "I'm busy," she said again. Gianni took a breath. "Katerina." "Fine." She untied her apron. She ran a hand over her hair, which had mostly escaped its tie in the way it always did during service, and she decided she wasn't going to think about that. She went out to the floor. He had finished the gravy. The bruschetta plate was also empty. He had a glass of the Barolo, her father's wine, the one she kept on the menu because she couldn't bring herself to remove it, and he was looking at it with an expression she couldn't quite name. "You wanted to speak with me," she said. He looked up. Something in his expression was slightly different than it had been in the conference room. Not softer, exactly, but less armored. The way a person looks when they've been briefly disarmed by something beautiful and haven't yet decided what to do about it. Your father made this gravy, he said. His recipe. I make it now. It tastes like something my grandmother used to make, in Salerno. She was silent for a moment. My father came from Salerno, she said. I know, Marco Bellini. He said her father's name with a particular weight, the way you say the name of someone you've done your research on. He opened this restaurant in 1992, came over in 1988 with almost nothing, built this from scratch. A beat. He was respected in the neighborhood. He was loved in the neighborhood, she corrected. There's a difference. He accepted that with a small inclination of his head. There is. She stood at the edge of the table, one hand on the chair back, and looked at him looking at her, and she thought, what are you doing here, Nero Falcone? What are you actually doing here? I'll come back, he said, if that's all right. You own the building, she said. You can go wherever you want. That's not what I mean, he said. She looked at him for a moment longer. Then she said, we're open Tuesday through Sunday. Reservations recommended. She straightened. Thank you for coming, Mr. Falcone. Enjoy the Barolo. She went back to the kitchen. For the rest of the service, she did not look through the pass-through. She did not need to. She already knew he was still there. He came back on Wednesday. Not with a reservation. She checked the system twice that morning, and his name wasn't in it. She told herself she wasn't looking for it. The day was busy. A supplier issue with the olive oil, a staff meeting about the holiday schedule, her mother calling at noon with a lasagna she'd made and wanted to bring over, which Katerina accepted because refusing her mother's lasagna was a battle she'd stopped fighting years ago. The lunch service was ordinary. The regulars, the NYU crowd, the Columbia professors at table 4, and the afternoon prep went smoothly, and she had almost managed to get through an entire shift without thinking about the meeting on Park Avenue, or the letter on the counter, or the deadline that was now 5.5 weeks away. Then Gianni appeared in the kitchen doorway at 7:15 during the evening rush and said, with careful neutrality, "Walk in at the bar. Asked for you." She looked up from the pasta she was plating. He said his name was Falcone, Gianni added, and his face was completely expressionless in the way that was its own kind of expression. She handed the plate to Marco and untied her apron. He was at the bar, not at a table, which meant he hadn't come to eat, or at least not primarily. He had a glass of water, and he was looking around the restaurant with the steady, measuring attention that she was beginning to recognize as his default mode, the way some people always look like they're doing math. She came around behind the bar instead of approaching from the dining room. The bar was hers. She knew every bottle, every glass, the sound each drawer made when you pulled it, the exact slant of the light from the pendant above it. On her side of the bar, she felt the ground under her feet. "No reservation," she said. "No," he agreed. He looked at her without the flicker of apology that a normal person might have. "I was nearby." "People are nearby all the time. They don't all come to my bar." "I wanted to see it at service." He turned back to the room. The dining room was full, every table occupied, the particular warm noise of a restaurant at its best filling the air. "Saturday I came early. This is different." She studied his profile. He was watching the room the way someone watches a fire, not for information, but because it was drawing him in some way he hadn't anticipated. "What do you see?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. "A room that knows it's alive," he said finally. She hadn't expected that. She looked away before he could catch her expression. She poured 2 glasses of wine without asking, the Barolo again, the same one, and set one in front of him and kept one for herself. He looked at the glass and then at her. "Are you going to drink with me?" he said. "I'm going to try to understand what you actually want," she said. "That seems to require wine." The corner of his mouth moved again. "Fair." They drank. Around them the restaurant moved. Gianni seating a couple at table 12, Marco's voice rising briefly in the kitchen and then dropping, the sound of the espresso machine from the far end of the bar, old Mr. Giannotti laughing at something his daughter had said 2 tables over. "My father knew your father," Nero said. "Old Marco Falcone." "I know. My uncle mentioned it." They shook hands at the feast of San Gennaro. 20 years ago, maybe. "My father liked yours." He said it without sentiment, which made it feel more real than sentiment would have. He said Domenico Bellini was the last honest man in Little Italy. Caterina was quiet. That was meant as a compliment, he said. I know. She turned the wineglass in her hands. What happened to your father's promises doesn't have anything to do with you, I suppose. My father's promises died with him. He said it flatly, without grief she could detect, but she thought she heard something underneath it. Not grief, but its scar tissue. That's how it works. Not here, she said. Here, a promise is a promise until the person who made it comes back to break it themselves. He looked at her. It was a long look, the kind that costs something. That's why it needs to survive, he said quietly. She blinked. What? This. He gestured, a minimal movement that somehow encompassed the whole room. The thing you've built here, the thing your father built, it needs to survive. That's what I told you in the meeting, and I meant it. Not as a threat, as a fact. You're telling me you're destroying it for its own good. I'm telling you I'm offering you a way to carry it forward. Whether you want to accept that is your decision. She looked at him across the bar. The wine was dark between them, the light low and warm, and she thought, You are a very complicated man, Nero Falcone, and I am not sure that any of this is as straightforward as you make it sound. Why are you really here? She asked. He held her gaze. For a moment she thought he was going to deflect, give her the same careful, controlled answer he'd given everything with so far. Instead, he said, I ate your father's gravy, and I sat in this room, and I didn't want to leave. The honesty of it surprised her. It surprised him too, she thought. She saw it in the slight tightening of his jaw, the way a person looks when they've said more than they planned. She picked up her glass. Come back Saturday, she said. I'll make something different. She walked back to the kitchen. He left $100 on the bar for the wine and the water. She didn't tell Gianni to return it. He came on Saturday, then the following Tuesday, then Thursday. By the second week, Gianni had stopped announcing him and started just setting his usual glass of Barolo at the corner of the bar before he arrived, in the particular way of front-of-house professionals who register patterns before anyone else does and draw no public attention to what they've noticed. The restaurant staff noticed too. How could they not, when the man who had sent the eviction notice was now a semi-regular, sitting at the bar or occasionally at table 7, watching the room with that unhurried attention of his. Marco, the sous chef, who had the political awareness of someone who had worked in Italian restaurant kitchens for 20 years, said nothing, but started plating the specials with an extra degree of care on the nights Falcone came. Lucia, the youngest of the waitstaff, asked Caterina once if he was a food critic, and Caterina said no, and Lucia said, he looks at everything like he's evaluating it, and Caterina said, that's just how he is. How he is, Lucia repeated, with a tone that suggested she found this explanatory in ways Caterina had not intended. But the thing that Caterina couldn't dismiss, that she turned over in her mind during the slow hours of prep and the long nights after closing, was that he was right about the room. Each time he came, each time she watched him from the kitchen or from the bar, she saw him settle into it in a way that was at odds with everything else she knew about him. He sat differently here than he must sit in his offices, in his penthouse, in the boardrooms and the nightclubs and the places men like him occupied. Here there was something less guarded about the set of his shoulders, the angle of his jaw, as if the restaurant was slowly working on him the way kitchens worked on everything, with heat and time and the particular alchemy of something real. She made him different things each visit. Not because she was trying to impress him, or not only because of that, but because she found herself wanting to see what he'd respond to. The carbonara on Tuesday, the branzino with herbs on Thursday, a version of her grandmother's stuffed artichokes on Saturday that she hadn't made in 2 years and had to spend an hour reconstructing from memory and instinct. He ate everything with that same focused attention. He complimented her sometimes, directly, without flourish, in ways that landed differently than compliments usually did. This is remarkable, he'd said about the artichokes, and she'd believed him because he said it like a fact rather than a courtesy. They talked. Not always much, and not always about anything of consequence, but the conversations began to build on each other in a way that surprised her, like laying stone, one course at a time, so that what emerged was something solid before you'd noticed you were building. She learned things. He'd grown up in Brooklyn, not Manhattan. She'd assumed Manhattan, but he corrected her once with something that was almost amusement. He'd gone to college, which surprised her more than it should have, because she'd absorbed the idea of the Falcones as men of action rather than reflection. He'd studied economics, which did not surprise her at all. He liked architecture, which did surprise her. He said it with a kind of quiet passion that felt like something private he'd momentarily forgotten to conceal. He didn't talk about the family business. She didn't ask about it. That was an unspoken boundary, and she respected it. Partly because she was afraid of what she might find out, and partly because she didn't need to know everything to have a conversation with someone. That was something her father had always said. You don't need a person's whole history to share a meal with them. But she was not naive. She knew what the Falcone name meant. She knew that the clean offices on Park Avenue, and the tasteful letterhead, and the real estate portfolio were not the whole story. That there was another register to this man's life entirely. The one that didn't get written about in business magazines. The one that operated in a different language. A language of debt and obligation and power that ran in channels under the surface of everything. She knew it, and she put it in a compartment in her mind and kept it there. Because that was the only way to be honest about what was happening. That she was spending time with him willingly. That she looked forward to his visits in a way she kept having to reframe as strategic before admitting to herself that it wasn't purely that. He was not what she'd expected. That was the most honest way she could put it. And she had grown up in a neighborhood where men who were not what you expected were often the most dangerous kind. On his fourth visit, a Thursday, cool and rainy, the kind of November evening that turned restaurants into refuges, he arrived earlier than usual, before the service rush, and found her in the dining room rather than the kitchen. She was at table 7 with her notebook and the week's receipts, doing the accounting that she did at this hour most nights when she needed quiet. He paused in the doorway. She looked up. "Early," she said. "I know." He didn't apologize. "Can I sit?" She gestured at the chair across from her. He sat. She went back to the receipts for a moment, not to be rude, but because she needed to finish the column she was on, and also because she didn't want to make too much of the fact that he'd come early, that he'd wanted to see the restaurant in this quiet mode. "What are you working on?" he asked. "Accounts. We had a good October." "Despite everything." "Because of everything," she said, without looking up. When people feel like something might disappear, they come to it more. They want to hold on. She closed the notebook. "You're making my October numbers good," which is a very specific kind of irony. He looked at her steadily. "Katerina," he said. It was the first time he'd used her name. Just her name. Not Ms. Bellini, not the careful professional distance of the previous weeks. It landed like a change in atmospheric pressure, that slight shift you feel before a storm. She met his eyes. "The deadline," he said. "November 15th. That's 2 weeks." "I know when it is. I need your answer." She looked at him across the table. The restaurant was quiet around them, the light low and warm, the street outside gray with rain. She had been thinking about this for 3 weeks, turning it over, working the edges of it like dough that wouldn't come together. "The restaurant stays the same," she said. "Not evolved, not repositioned. The menu might change. Menus always change. But the character of this place, what it is, what my father made it, that doesn't change. The space will be renovated as part of the building development. There will be changes. Cosmetic changes," she said. "Surface. The kitchen gets upgraded, fine. The dining room gets repainted, fine. But the tables stay the same number. The menu stays Italian. The pricing stays accessible. Bellini's stays Bellini's." He was quiet. "And," she said, "the lease is for 10 years. Not 5, 10. That's not what I offered." "I know. It's what I need." She held his gaze. "If you want Bellini's to survive, you give it room to survive in. You don't give something a 5-year lease and call it preservation." A long silence. Rain against the windows. 10 years, he said finally. Favorable rate, agreed terms, kitchen renovation included. She breathed. "But I want something in return," he said. "What?" He looked at her. Teach me the Sunday gravy recipe. She stared at him. My grandmother's recipe, he said, and now his voice was quieter. Something in it she hadn't heard before, something undefended. She died when I was 12. I've been trying to find it for 20 years. Your father's gravy, it's as close as I've gotten. She was very still. That's what you want? She said. That's what I want. She looked at him for a long time. This man who had everything, who had power and money and the cold efficiency of someone who had built himself from whatever he'd come from into something formidable. This man who had come into her restaurant and eaten her father's gravy and remembered his grandmother. Sundays, she said. Come on Sundays. The kitchen opens at 10. His expression changed. Not a smile, exactly, but the nearest thing she'd seen to one on his face that wasn't the controlled half-curve of his usual deflections. Something real. Sunday, he said. 10 o'clock. The first Sunday he arrived at 9:58. Katerina had been in the kitchen since 8, which she told herself was normal, that she always started early on Sundays, which was true. She had the sofrito ready, the trinity of onion, carrot, and celery sweating gently in olive oil in the large pot, and the tomatoes opened, and the pork ribs set out, and the sausages from the butcher on Grand Street that her father had used since she was a child. She'd set up a second cutting board. She heard him knock at the back door, the kitchen entrance, off the alley, which meant he'd come around the back rather than through the front, which meant either he was familiar with the layout of restaurant kitchens or he'd thought about it. She suspected the latter. She let him in. He was in dark jeans and a gray sweater, and this was the most informal she'd seen him, and it changed something about him in a way she tried not to examine too closely. He looked around the kitchen with the same measuring attention he always had, but there was something different in it here. Less evaluation, more curiosity. Take that apron, she said, nodding toward the hook by the door. He looked at the apron. It was red-checked cotton, a twin of the one she wore, which had been her mother's. He put it on without comment. He looked faintly absurd and completely unself-conscious about it, which she found inexplicably charming. Watch first, she said, then you do. She taught him the way her father had taught her, by doing, by narrating, by letting the kitchen speak as much as she did. The Sunday gravy was not a complicated recipe, in the sense that it had few ingredients and no techniques that required professional training. What it required was time and attention and the willingness to be present with it, to respond to it, to trust what your nose and eyes and the sound of the pot told you rather than watching the clock. It required, she told him, the understanding that a good gravy was not made so much as it was coaxed, that you were negotiating with tomatoes and pork and olive oil and thyme, and the negotiation had to be respectful or the whole thing would know. He listened with a quality of attention she hadn't encountered often, absolute, unhurried, without the ambient distraction that most people carried with them everywhere. He watched her hands. He asked precise questions. How do you know when the sofrito is ready? What are you looking for in the pork at this stage? How does the smell change? Good questions. The questions of someone who wanted to actually understand rather than just replicate. She let him take over the stirring when the tomatoes went in, standing beside him at the stove. Close, because the pot was large and the kitchen not vast, and the proximity was simply functional, she told herself. Lower, she said. You're keeping it too high. You want it at a murmur, not a simmer. He turns the heat down. Now leave it. For how long? Until it's ready. She saw his look. An hour minimum, probably 90 minutes, but you'll know. How? The way you know most things, she said. The room changes, the smell deepens, the color goes darker. She paused. You stop wondering if it's ready, and you know. He looked at the pot, then at her. Your father taught you this? My father taught me everything that matters in a kitchen. She leaned against the counter. He used to say that cooking was just love made visible. He was the kind of man who could say things like that without it sounding soft. He said it like a fact. Was he right? Every single time. The kitchen was quiet, except for the low sound of the gravy beginning to find its voice. Outside, Mulberry Street was just starting to wake up. She could hear, distantly, the church bells from St. Patrick's old cathedral, which rang at 10 on Sundays, and had been ringing at 10 on Sundays for as long as she could remember. My grandmother made gravy every Sunday, Nero said. He was still watching the pot. In her apartment in Brooklyn. Carroll Gardens. Old Carroll Gardens, before it changed. She used to start at 7 in the morning, and the whole building would smell like it by noon. A pause. She died when I was 12. Heart. I'm sorry. It was a long time ago. But the way he said it, the compression of it, told her it wasn't really. Who raised you after that? He looked at her, a beat. My father. She held his gaze and understood from the way he said it, the contained neutrality of it, that this was not a subject that opened easily. Did he teach you anything in the kitchen? She asked. He taught me not to be weak, Nero said, and not to trust things that don't last. He looked back at the pot. Not kitchen lessons exactly. She was quiet. The gravy murmured. She thought about what it cost a 12-year-old boy to lose the person who made the Sunday gravy, and what happened to a person when the things that were soft in them were taught out rather than cherished. That's why the gravy matters, she said quietly. It's not about the recipe. He turned to look at her, and for once the careful composure of him was fractionally undone, the way a wall shows a crack along a line of old stress. No, he said, it's not. They stood in the kitchen while the gravy found its way toward ready, and the church bells finished their count, and the Sunday light came through the high kitchen window in a single pale bar that crossed the floor between them. She thought, I am in serious trouble. She stirred the gravy. The news came from Gianni, who heard it from the delivery driver, who heard it from someone at the butcher on Grand, which was how all genuinely important information moved through Little Italy, laterally, through the food supply chain, in the reliable old way. A man named Cristiano Riva had been asking about Bellinis. Asking what? Caterina said. She was breaking down the dinner service, stacking linen, and she stopped with a napkin in her hands. Gianni leaned against the bar. Asking what kind of deal had been offered on the lease. Asking whether you'd signed anything yet. Asking when the renovation was scheduled. He paused. The Riva family has been trying to buy into this block for 3 years. You know that. She knew that. The Rivas were another family, newer money, newer power, the kind of people who moved in after the old structures had been weakened, like secondary growth after a fire. They had fingers in nightclubs, in a hotel in Midtown, in various constructions she'd never looked at too closely. What does this have to do with me? She said. If you haven't signed with Falcone yet, and the Rivas heard about the negotiation, they can't do anything. Falcone owns the building. They can make a competing offer for the building. It happens. If Falcone is sitting on a development deal that hasn't been closed, another buyer can come in with a higher number, and the whole thing gets complicated. Caterina set the napkin down. That would mean the lease negotiations start over. It would mean everything starts over. And the Rivas don't offer 10-year leases at favorable rates to family restaurants. They flip buildings. She sat down on a bar stool. The restaurant was empty. The overhead lights harsh now without the dinner service's warmth, showing every scuff and scratch and nick that the good light always forgave. I need to call Falcone, she said. Gianni raised an eyebrow. You have his number? He gave it to me after we finalized the lease terms. She paused. We haven't signed anything yet. We were waiting for the lawyers to draw up the formal documents. Then you need to sign the formal documents, Gianni said, with the simplicity of someone who has no patience for things that should be simple being complicated. She called the number. He answered on the second ring. Caterina. Her name again, just like that, immediate, and she noticed again the way it landed. Are you aware of the Riva family making inquiries about the Mulberry Street block? She said. A pause, shorter than she expected. Where did you hear that? This is Little Italy. I hear everything 2 days late and 3 streets over. I'm aware of it, he said. It's not your concern. Respectfully, it's entirely my concern. If they make a competing offer on the building before we've signed, they won't. You can't know that, Caterina. His voice was very steady. I know that. Trust me. I don't fully trust you yet, she said. I'm working on it, but we're not there. Another pause, and this one felt different. Not cold, but weighted, like something being measured. I'll have the lease documents drawn up by Monday, he said. My lawyer will send them to yours. We sign by Wednesday. Wednesday. And Katerina? Yes. The Rivas won't touch the building, not while it's mine. The way he said mine, quiet, absolute, she believed it completely. And that was not entirely a comfortable thing to believe, because it reminded her that the man in her kitchen on Sunday mornings, who stood beside her at the stove and asked careful questions about sofrito, was also the man who said things like that in that tone, and meant them in every register they could be meant in. Wednesday, she said. Good night. She hung up. The documents arrived Monday afternoon. She read them herself, then sent them to Diane Chen, who called her Tuesday morning and said they were solid. Better than she'd expected, actually. The rent was a significant increase from the existing lease, but genuinely favorable for the neighborhood at current market rates, and the 10-year term was unusual and valuable. He gave you a good deal, Diane said. I don't know why, given the leverage he had, but he did. He liked the Sunday gravy, Katerina said, a beat. I'm sorry? Nothing. Send the sign off. She signed on Wednesday. So did he. Gianni opened a bottle of Prosecco that evening, and the kitchen staff toasted to 10 more years. And Marco made pasta for everyone, and they ate standing at the prep counter, and it was exactly the kind of evening her father would have loved. She raised her glass and thought of the man who'd made it possible, and the complicated terrain that thought occupied in her chest. She didn't call him to tell him she'd opened the Prosecco. She almost did. 2 days later, she was walking back to the restaurant from the Green Market on Saturdays, the farmer's market on Grand, where she bought the best of what was in season, when a black car pulled alongside her and the window came down. Nero Falcone leaned across from the driver's seat. Get in, he said. She stopped. What? There's something you should see. His expression was level, but there was something in it she hadn't seen before, an urgency under the surface, compressed, controlled but present. It'll take an hour. I'll have you back before service. She looked at him. She looked at the car. She looked at the bag of vegetables in her arms. You're going to have to be significantly more specific than that, she said. It's about the building, he said. About the renovation plans. I want you to see them before the architects finalize anything. She studied him. Please, he said. And it was the first time she'd heard him use that word, and it sounded like it cost him something. She got in the car. He took her to an office in Tribeca, not Falcone Holdings, a smaller space that belonged to an architectural firm. The ride was 20 minutes, and they spent most of it in a silence that was companionable rather than awkward, which was its own kind of development. He drove himself, which she noted. A man like him might be expected to have a driver, and she'd seen the black town cars that appeared sometimes near the restaurant when he visited. But today he drove, and there was something unguarded about that. The slight loosening of a person who controls their own vehicle. The architectural office smelled of paper and coffee and had drawings on every surface, blueprints and renderings, and the particular organized chaos of people who think in space and scale. The architects, 2 of them, a man and a woman, both young, both clearly accustomed to Nero Falcone in the way of people who are paid to be calm around imposing clients, spread the plans across a drafting table without preamble. The Mulberry Street block, rendered in precise gray lines in elevation and section and floor plan. The new building rising above the existing footprint. The ground floor commercial spaces. And there, at the corner, facing both Mulberry and the side street, the largest of the ground floor units, with its own separate entrance and a kitchen indicated by the tight cluster of ventilation lines and equipment symbols. It was bigger than the current Bellini's, significantly. She studied the plans. Nero stood beside her, close enough that she was aware of the warmth of him, not saying anything, letting her look. You moved the entrance, she said. It faces the corner now, more visible, more foot traffic from both streets. The kitchen, doubled. You've been working in a kitchen that was undersized for the volume you do. I looked at your service numbers. He said it without being asked, as if it was obvious that he had been looking at her service numbers. New equipment, better ventilation, a proper prep space. She traced the floor plan with her finger. The dining room is bigger, but the table count is the same. More space between tables. You've been seating people too close together. It works now because the neighborhood likes it. It's familiar, but it means you lose service quality on busy nights. She looked at him. You've thought about this very carefully. I think carefully about things I care about. The silence that followed that sentence had a particular texture to it. Neither of them addressed it. The architects were suddenly very interested in a drawing on the opposite wall. She looked back at the plans. The new kitchen, the better proportioned dining room, the corner entrance that would double her visibility on the street. It was good. She hated admitting it, but it was good. Better than good. It was thoughtful, and the thoughtfulness of it was what got her, because a man who was simply doing a real estate transaction would not have cared about table spacing, or kitchen ventilation, or the foot traffic pattern on a corner in Little Italy. This is more than you promised, she said. I know. Why? He looked at her for a moment, then at the plans. Because it deserves to be more. She turned to face him fully. They were standing very close at the drafting table, the plans between them, the architects having found reasons to be in another part of the office entirely. You have to stop doing that, she said. What? Saying things like that. Doing things like this. She gestured at the plans. I need to be able to think of you clearly, and you keep making it harder. He looked at her. Something in his eyes, that gray-green depth, was very still, very focused, the way deep water is still. How do you think of me? He said. As the man who is saving my restaurant, and for reasons I don't entirely understand. That's not what I asked. She breathed. I think of you as a man I'm not supposed to want to trust, and I keep finding reasons to, and it unsettles me. He was quiet for a moment. Then, good. She stared at him. It should unsettle you, he said. It should unsettle both of us. That doesn't make it less true. She looked at him for a long moment, this man with his slate-gray eyes and his contained power and his grandmother's gravy recipe living somewhere in his memory like a wound. This man who was dangerous in more ways than she could count and thoughtful in ways she hadn't expected, and was standing 3 feet away from her in an architect's office in Tribeca, looking at her like she was the most interesting problem he had ever encountered. I should get back, she said. You should. Neither of them moved for another beat. Then she picked up her bag and said, The corner entrance is right, and the kitchen is right. Tell the architects to keep the original pendant lamps from the current dining room. We'll reuse them. My father picked those lamps. Done, he said. She walked to the elevator. She pressed the button. While she waited, she did not look back. He didn't say anything else, but she heard him, the controlled quiet of him, for the rest of the day. Gianni Napolitano had been in the restaurant business for 34 years. He had been front-of-house manager at Bellini's for 12 of them, which meant he had watched Caterina Bellini grow from a girl who did her homework at the corner table into the woman who ran this place with the same combination of precision and heart that her father had had. And he felt about her, though he had never said this aloud and never would, something like what he imagined a father felt. He had therefore been paying attention to the situation with the Falcone man since the first evening the reservation appeared, and he had drawn conclusions, and he was keeping those conclusions to himself, because Caterina Bellini was not a woman who appreciated having her inner life commented on. But one evening in mid-November, after service, when she was at the bar going over the inventory, and he was at the other end doing the closing check, he said, without preamble, How well do you know who he is? She didn't look up. I know who he is. You know what the papers say and what the neighborhood says. That's not the same as knowing. She set her pen down. She looked at him. Gianni, I'm not saying anything you don't already know, he said. I'm asking you to say it. She was quiet for a moment. The Falcone family has been in organized crime for 40 years. The legitimate business is real, but it didn't come from nowhere, and it doesn't operate in isolation. She said it calmly, the way you say things you've already made peace with. He's the head of both the visible and invisible parts of that operation. Yes, Johnny said, and I know that. Do you know that he has people in his organization who have done very serious things? Do you know that the building he bought on the corner of Hester Street, the owner of that building had a problem with his car the week before he agreed to sell? She was very still. Is that verified? It's what people say. People say a lot of things in this neighborhood. They're right more often than they're wrong about things like this. Gianni put down his clipboard. I'm not telling you to be afraid of him. I don't think he's a man who would hurt you. But I think you should know what world he comes from and what it costs to be close to it. She looked at him for a long time. Why are you telling me this now? Because of the way you looked when you came back from that architect's office 2 weeks ago. He said it simply, without accusation. I've worked here long enough to know your face, Katerina. There was something in it that afternoon that I hadn't seen before. She turned back to the inventory. I'm not naive. I know that. You're one of the least naive people I know. He picked up his clipboard. But naive and willing to be surprised are different things. And you looked surprised. She was silent for a moment. Then, he's showing me who he wants to be. And I keep wondering whether it's real. That, Gianni said, is exactly the right question. He went back to the closing check. She went back to the inventory. The restaurant was quiet around them, holding all its decades of ordinary and extraordinary life in its walls. The following Sunday, Nero came to the kitchen earlier than usual, 8:45, and she'd barely finished her coffee when she heard the knock. He looked different when she opened the door. Something tighter about him, something that hadn't been there on other Sundays. Not agitated, but compressed, like a man who has been holding something in for longer than is comfortable. She let him in without asking. He tied the apron. He started the sofrito. She watched him move through the steps. He knew them now, in the sequence and the timing, could read the pan the way she'd taught him, and she thought that this was what the Sundays had made of him, a man who could stand in a kitchen and be present in it. What happened? She said. He kept his eyes on the pan. Work. Tell me. A pause. There was a situation with someone who thought that our arrangement on this block was an invitation to test limits. That's handled now. She thought of Gianni's words, the car, the week before the sale. Handled how? She said. He turned to look at her. The thing in his eyes was clear now. Not guilt, but the particular weight of a man who does what is necessary and lives with what that costs. In the way that things like that get handled, he said. She held his gaze. Is anyone hurt? Not physically. A complicated truth, but a specific one. She accepted it. The Rivas? She said. Something shifted in his face. Surprise, quickly controlled. You know about that. I know about most things, she said. Gianni tells me things. Delivery men tell Gianni things. It's a whole system. It's efficient, he said, with the trace of dry appreciation she'd begun to recognize. Is it over? For now. He turned back to the sofrito. Things like this are rarely completely over, but they're quiet for the time being. She stood beside him at the stove. The kitchen was filling with the smell of the sofrito, onion and carrot and celery softening in olive oil, the foundational smell of everything she'd grown up with. She thought about Gianni's question. Do you know what it costs to be close to it? Nero, she said. He looked at her. If being close to you makes the restaurant a target, it doesn't, he said, with quiet certainty. Being close to me means no one touches it. That's how it works. She looked at him, at the absolute steadiness of him, the way he inhabited his own certainty the way other people inhabited rooms. That's not a completely comfortable thing to hear, she said. I know. He held her gaze. But it's true. She handed him the wooden spoon. The tomatoes go in 10 minutes, she said. He turned back to the pan. The feast of San Gennaro ended in November. It was officially the September feast, but in Little Italy, the celebrations bled through the autumn, and there were always neighborhood events that held the spirit of it. The tables in the street, the lights strung between buildings, the smell of zeppoli from the vendor on the corner who appeared seasonally and reliably. The Block Association held a winter kickoff party the second Saturday of November. It was an informal affair. The restaurants set tables on the sidewalk for an afternoon. There was wine from the wine shop on Mulberry. There was music from a trio of older men who played at every neighborhood event and had been playing at them since Caterina's father's time. Bellini's participated every year. This year, Katerina set up 3 tables outside with their red-checked cloths and offered the Sunday gravy and the bruschetta and the stuffed artichokes, and the kitchen made 200 arancini for the occasion. The afternoon was cold but bright, and the neighborhood turned out. Families, regulars, the old men from the social club on Mott Street, the younger people who were newer to the neighborhood but had found their way into it. She was refilling a serving dish when she looked up and saw him. He was standing at the edge of the street fair, in a dark coat, alone. He was watching the tables, watching the people, watching Mulberry Street alive with its own life in a way it only fully was on afternoons like this. He had the look of someone who wanted to be inside something and isn't sure they're allowed. She left the dish and went to him. "You came," she said. He looked at her. "I heard about it." "From who?" "Johnny, as it happens." A slight pause. "He called my office." She blinked. She was going to have words with Johnny, who had apparently decided to take matters into his own hands while simultaneously advising caution. This was very like Johnny. "Come eat," she said. She took him to the tables. She introduced him to people. Not as Nero Falcone, not with the name that carried its complicated weight, but simply as Nero. He comes to the restaurant sometimes, and watched him navigate the neighborhood with the same careful attention he brought to everything. He shook hands with the old men from the social club and said something to them in Italian that made them laugh in the particular way of men recognizing something familiar in an unexpected place. He ate the arancini and told Lucia, who had made them, that they were perfect, and Lucia blushed to the roots of her hair. He was not a man who charmed, exactly. He was a man who attended, and the people of Little Italy, who had a finely calibrated sense for the difference, responded to the attention. Mrs. Conti, from the 4th floor above the wine shop, who was 83 and had opinions about everything, cornered him for 15 minutes while Katerina watched from a distance, and at the end of it, she patted his arm and said something that made him nod, and afterward, when Katerina asked what she'd said, he told her, "Your father would have liked this neighborhood." "She thought you were talking about your father?" Katerina said. "I didn't correct her," he said. The afternoon darkened into early evening. The lights came on. The trio began to play something slow and old that her father had loved, and people gathered around the music the way people gather around warmth. Nero stood beside her. Not touching, there was still that careful distance between them, the professional propriety of 2 people who were technically in a landlord-tenant relationship and both aware of the other things also present in the space. But beside her, in the way that had its own language. "Dance with me," she said. She wasn't sure, afterward, why she'd said it. The music, maybe. The lights, the cold air, the smell of zeppoli and wine and her father's gravy. The look on his face when the old woman had told him his father would have liked the neighborhood. He looked at her. "Here?" he said. "Other people are dancing," she said, which was true. 3 couples had drifted into the space in front of the musicians, moving in the easy way of people who have danced together many times. He didn't say anything else. He offered his hand. She took it. He danced well, not showily, but with the same quality he brought to everything. A quiet competence, the confidence of someone who inhabits their body without anxiety. He held her at a proper distance, one hand at her waist, one holding hers, and they moved to the slow music in the November street, and she could feel his hand warm through the wool of her coat. "I grew up watching people dance at things like this," she said, because the silence was close to something she wasn't ready for. "Me too," he said. "My grandmother used to dance at every feast, every Saint's Day, every holiday, any occasion she could find." His hand shifted slightly at her waist, not closer, just more settled. "She said people who don't dance have forgotten how to be happy." "She sounds remarkable." "She was the best person I knew," he said. Simple, unguarded. She looked up at him. They were close enough now that she could see the detail of his face clearly, the old scar along his jaw that she'd noticed before and never asked about, the slight lines at the corners of his eyes that deepened when he almost smiled, the quality of his attention, which was entirely on her. "Nero," she said. "Don't," he said. "Don't what?" "Don't talk yourself out of it," he said quietly. "Whatever you're about to say, don't." She was quiet. The music played. The street was alive with light and voices and cold air. His hand was warm at her waist. She didn't talk herself out of it. She walked home alone that night. He'd offered to drive her, and she'd declined, because she needed the 20-minute walk from the restaurant to her apartment on Prince Street, needed the cold and the noise and the ground under her feet to think. He'd accepted this without argument, which she'd noticed, a man with his particular quality of authority who did not push when she set a limit. She had not been imagining it. That was the conclusion she arrived at by the time she reached her building. The way he'd held her while they danced, the "don't talk yourself out of it," the quality of attention that had been building through every Sunday morning and every evening at the bar, and every conversation conducted over the counter of her father's restaurant. It was real, and it was reciprocal, and it was also profoundly complicated. She sat on the steps outside her building, stone cold, but she needed a minute before going inside, and let herself be honest about it. She wanted him. That was the honest part. The part she'd been packaging in more respectable terms like, "he's interesting," and "I understand him better than expected." She wanted him the way you want something that you know is not entirely safe, the particular pull of things that are beautiful and dangerous and real. The complicated part was everything else. The name, the power, the way Gianni had said the car the week before he agreed to sell. The invisible machinery of his life that ran parallel to the visible, and was not something she could pretend didn't exist because she'd seen him make Sunday gravy and dance in the street. She'd grown up in Little Italy. She knew how the old families worked, not from the inside, but from proximity, from overhearing, from the textures of a neighborhood shaped by that world for decades. She was not romantic about it. She knew what it cost. She went inside. She made tea. She did not sleep for a long time. The following Sunday he came as usual, and they made the gravy as usual, and the rhythm of it was the same, except that the thing between them that had always been present and managed was no longer quite as manageable. She was aware of every time he came close to reach for something, aware of his voice in the kitchen, low and even, asking about the next step, aware of the specific quality of silence when they were both watching the pot and neither of them was speaking. After the gravy was made and they were eating, she always fed him when the gravy was done, a bowl of pasta with the sauce and whatever bread she had, sitting at the kitchen prep counter because the dining room wasn't open yet. He set down his fork and looked at her. "I need to tell you something," he said. "All right." "About the Riva situation." He was very still. "It's not over in the way I told you it was." She looked at him. "Meaning what?" "Meaning there's pressure being applied on a different vector. One of my associates has been approached, offered information about the Mulberry Street development in exchange for facilitating a sale to the Rivas. Information that could complicate things." "Complicate things how?" He met her eyes. "There are aspects of how this building was acquired, how the original owner decided to sell, that, if characterized in a particular way to the right people, could create legal complications for Falcone Holdings." She was quiet for a moment. "You're telling me the building purchase wasn't entirely clean." "I'm telling you that business transactions of this size never are entirely clean, and that someone is trying to use that to force a sale." He paused. "It's manageable, but I wanted you to know." She studied his face. He was looking at her with the directness she'd come to expect. No evasion, no softening of anything uncomfortable. "Why are you telling me this?" she said. "Because you deserve to know what you're in the middle of. And because He stopped, a rare hesitation. "Because I don't want there to be things between us that you don't know about." Things between us. He'd said it simply, acknowledging them as a fact. "What happens if the legal complications materialize?" she said. "They won't. Absolute. But if they did?" He held her gaze. "Then I handle it. That's what I do, Katerina. I handle things." She thought about that for a moment, about what it meant to be with someone, because that was what they were moving toward. She could no longer pretend otherwise. Who handled things in the way he handled things. The weight of that. The particular freedom and the particular cage of it. "The gravy is good today," she said. A pause. "Yes." "You're getting better at the sofrito. You let it go long enough now. You used to rush it." He looked at her. Something in his expression, That almost smile, the real one, the one that reached his eyes. "Are we done talking about the other thing?" "We're going to come back to it," she said. "I just needed a minute." He picked up his fork. "Take as many minutes as you need." She looked at him across the prep counter, in the kitchen her father had built, the smell of the Sunday gravy filling the air between them, and she thought that this was perhaps the most complicated thing she had ever chosen to walk toward. She ate her pasta. She walked toward it anyway. He asked her to dinner in the second week of December. Not at the restaurant. A restaurant in Midtown that had a Michelin star and a reservation list 3 months long, which had somehow accommodated them on 48 hours' notice, which she didn't ask about. She wore the black dress she'd bought for her best friend's wedding 2 years ago and had worn once since. She wore her hair down for the first time in his presence. She always kept it up at work, practical and necessary in a kitchen. But tonight she let it go, all that dark weight of it, and stood in front of her bathroom mirror and acknowledged to herself that she was trying, which was its own kind of admission. He was waiting outside the restaurant when she arrived. He'd seen her walk up from the corner. She saw his eyes go to her from half a block away and stay there, with an attention that was considerably more personal than anything she'd observed in him before, a directness that had nothing controlled about it. She reached him. "You look—" He stopped, started again. "You look beautiful." She raised an eyebrow. "You hesitated." "I was deciding whether extraordinary was too much." "Extraordinary is not too much," she said. "It's accurate." He looked at her for a moment. That look, the full attention one, and then the corner of his mouth moved in the real smile. He held the door. The restaurant was everything she'd expected it to be, dark-lit and beautiful, the kind of place where the tables were far enough apart that you could hear yourself think, where the sommelier knew which vintage to recommend before you'd finished describing what you were in the mood for, where the food was, she admitted, genuinely exceptional. She was aware throughout the meal that they were being watched, not obtrusively, but there was a quality of attention directed toward their table that she registered. He was, she understood, a man known in rooms like this. She wondered what people made of her, in the black dress with her father's watch, across the table from Nero Falcone. They talked differently here than in the kitchen, more freely, paradoxically, as if the neutral ground of someone else's restaurant released them from the particular roles they played in hers. He told her about the architecture he loved, specific buildings, specific details, the way he'd gone to see the Guggenheim as a child and stood in the rotunda looking up until his father had to physically collect him. She told him about Salerno, which she'd visited once at 24, the trip she'd taken to see where her father came from, standing in the streets of the old city and feeling the strange double exposure of a place you know through stories. He listened the way he always listened. She talked the way she only talked to people she trusted, which she registered and let herself register without reframing it. After dessert, a panna cotta that she thought silently was close but not as good as her mother's, and said nothing about, he refilled her wine glass and said, "I want to ask you something." "Ask." "The restaurant," he said. "What happens to it in 20 years? What you want it to be?" She looked at him, surprised by the question, by the horizon of it. "Still there," she said. "Still the Sunday gravy. Still old Mr. Gennady at his table by the window, or his grandchildren, if he's not there." She turned the wine glass. "I want it to be the kind of place that outlasts the things that try to change the neighborhood. I want it to still be itself in 20 years in the way that very few things in New York stay themselves." He was quiet. "Your father built something worth that." "My father built something worth everything." She looked at him steadily. "What happened with the man who owned this building before you bought it?" A beat. He held her gaze. He was encouraged to see the value of the offer. Encouraged how? "In ways I'm not going to describe at dinner." "Did anyone get hurt?" "No one was physically harmed." She held his gaze. "That's a very specific answer. It's an honest one." She breathed. "I know who you are," she said. "I don't think I can pretend otherwise. And I'm not asking you to be someone you're not. But I need to know, if this—" She stopped. started again. If we're going to... Yes, he said. She blinked. I hadn't finished the sentence. I know what you were going to ask. He leaned slightly forward. If we're going to be whatever this is becoming, do you need to know that you're safe, that the restaurant is safe, that the things and people you care about are protected? He held her gaze. The answer is yes, to all of it, in every version of who I am. She looked at him for a long moment. That's a lot of certainty, she said. I'm a certain kind of person, he said, about the things that matter. She looked at his hands on the table, those careful, precise hands that had stirred a pot of Sunday gravy every week for a month and a half, that had shaken hands with the old men at the street fair and been patted by Mrs. Conti, the hands that, in another register of his life, did things she was choosing not to ask about tonight. She reached across the table and put her hand over his. He turned his hand under hers and held it, and that was that. The thing that had been building since October finally arriving, quietly, over good wine and panna cotta in a midtown restaurant, as so many important things arrive, not with drama, but with the simple weight of truth. It appeared in the gossip pages of one of the city weeklies, the kind of publication that photographed people at restaurant openings and gallery events and charity galas and packaged it as social documentation. Someone had been at the Midtown restaurant that night, and the photograph showed them at the table, her hand over his face turned toward hers with that particular focused attention, and she supposed from the outside it was quite evident what the picture was of. The caption said, Nero Falcone, Falcone Holdings, with an unidentified companion. Her mother called at 8 in the morning. Caterina Maria Bellini, she said, which was how she opened conversations that were going to require full names. Mama, I'm looking at a photograph, I know, of you and Nero Falcone holding hands at a restaurant. We weren't exactly holding hands. I have eyes. I can see hands. A pause in which Caterina could hear her mother composing herself. How long has this been happening? Nothing has happened, Mama. We have a business relationship. Caterina, I am your mother, and I am 64 years old, and I have lived in this neighborhood for 40 years, and I know exactly what a business relationship looks like, and that photograph is not a business relationship. A longer pause. It's complicated, Caterina said. His father knew your father, her mother said. His father was also a man who scared people, and your father liked him anyway. And I used to ask your father why, and he said, because even men like that have something human in them, if you look in the right place. Another pause. Your father was not always right, but he was right more often than I gave him credit for. Are you saying you approve? I'm saying I'm frightened, her mother said simply. And I'm saying that I trust your judgment, which is not the same thing. Come for dinner on Sunday. I have the restaurant. Come for dinner after the restaurant. Yes, Mama. He called that afternoon. You saw the photograph, he said, when she picked up. My mother called. My lawyer called. A pause. I apologize. That restaurant should have been more private. You don't control everything, she said. I prefer to control what I can. His voice had an edge she recognized now, the tightening when something had occurred that he hadn't anticipated and didn't like. How are you? Fine, she said. Slightly famous, apparently. The publication is minor. It won't... Nero, she cut him off gently. It's all right. I'm a 31-year-old woman who had dinner with someone and held his hand. I don't need to be apologized at. A silence. Then, your uncle called my office. She closed her eyes. Sal. He left a message with my assistant. The message was specific. I will speak to Sal. He's protective of you, Nero said, and she heard something in it. Not resentment, but something almost like approval, reluctant and surprised. He is, she said, annoyingly so. What did the message say? That if I was using you to get access to the restaurant and the neighborhood, he would make his feelings known. A pause. His phrasing was more colorful. I'm sorry. Don't be. He was quiet for a moment. He's right to ask the question. She was still. And the answer? The answer, he said slowly, is that I bought the building before I met you. The restaurant was a calculation, And then I ate your father's Sunday gravy and sat in that room, and things stopped being a calculation and became something else. What's something else? The thing that has me calling you the afternoon after a photograph appears, instead of telling my lawyer to manage it and moving on, he said. That's something else. She sat with that. Come to Sunday dinner at my mother's, she said. A silence so complete she could hear him breathing. You're inviting me to meet your mother, he said. She's making Sunday dinner. I'll be there after service. You should come. Another silence. Katerina, you said you wanted things between us that I know about. I want things between us that she knows about. She paused. Also, she's going to find a way to meet you regardless, and if I control the circumstances, it will be less traumatic for everyone involved. A quiet sound that was, she was fairly certain, him suppressing a laugh. What time? 8 o'clock. Don't bring anything. She'll have already made everything, and bringing something implies you think it isn't enough, and she will be offended. Noted, he said. 8 o'clock. She hung up and thought about her father, who had looked at men who scared people and found something human in them if he looked in the right place. She was looking. What she found continued to surprise her. Rosa Bellini lived 3 blocks from the restaurant, in the same apartment she'd shared with Domenico for 28 years, which she had not changed in any material way since his death, except to add a second lock to the front door, which she'd been meaning to do for years, and finally had the authority to decide on herself. She was 64 and looked 55, with the dark eyes and strong opinions of a companion woman who had built her life in a foreign city with the same combination of charm and stubbornness that her daughter had inherited. She cooked the way she breathed, constantly, without planning it, the apartment always smelling of something. She had opinions about everyone's business and expressed them directly, and she had loved her husband with a completeness that Katerina sometimes found painful to observe, because it set a standard. Nero Falcone arrived at Rosa Bellini's apartment at 8:02 p.m. on a Sunday in December with nothing in his hands, because Katerina had told him not to bring anything. He had apparently considered and rejected the option of flowers, which was the right call. He was wearing a dark jacket over a black sweater, which was the most casual Katerina had seen him in company, and there was something in the slight adjustment of his posture when Rosa opened the door that she recognized. The recalibration of a man encountering something he doesn't have a protocol for. Rosa looked at him for 5 full seconds. Then she opened the door wider. "Come in," she said. "You're thin." He blinked. You're not eating enough. Sit down." Katerina, from behind him, made a sound that she disguised as a cough. Rosa fed him. This was the primary and non-negotiable mode of Rosa Bellini's hospitality. She expressed everything through food, approval and love, and territorial marking and assessment. She had made the braised lamb that had been her Sunday second course for 30 years, and the roasted potatoes, and the good bread from the bakery on Elizabeth Street, and the almond cake that was her mother's recipe from Positano. She fed him and she watched him, and Nero Falcone ate with the same focused attention he brought to everything, and said, "This is remarkable about the lamb," and meant it. And Rosa's expression shifted in a way that Katerina recognized as the first stage of acceptance. "Your family is from Salerno," Rosa said. It wasn't a question. "My grandmother was from Salerno. My father was born here." "And your grandmother cooked?" "Everything," he said. "Every Sunday." Rosa looked at him with her dark eyes. "My husband was from Salerno," she said. "He came here with nothing, and he built a restaurant and he fed this neighborhood for 30 years. She paused. "My daughter is continuing that. I want to know what your intentions are toward that." Katerina set her fork down. "Mama, I'm talking to him, not you." Nero met Rosa's eyes steadily. "I have signed a 10-year lease with favorable terms that ensures Bellini's remains in operation in a renovated space. I have designed the renovation to preserve the character of the restaurant while improving its capacity and function." He paused. "I am also, separately, hoping to be welcome at your daughter's table for reasons that aren't business." Rosa looked at him for a long moment. She poured more wine into his glass without asking. "My husband would have had things to say to you about the way you do business," she said. "I imagine he would," Nero said, without flinching. He also would have said that a man who comes to someone's table and eats what is offered and says, "This is remarkable," and means it, that man has something good in him. She looked at her wine glass. Domenico believed that. "With respect," Nero said quietly, "it's true." A silence. Rosa looked at Caterina. Something moved between them, the particular wordless communication of mothers and daughters who have known each other for 31 years. Then Rosa said, "There is more lamb. You will have more lamb." He had more lamb. They walked back to the restaurant afterward. Caterina needed to check on the closing, a Sunday habit she'd never been able to break. And the night was cold and clear, the December air sharp enough to see your breath. He walked beside her without the distance that had characterized the earlier weeks, close enough that his arm occasionally brushed hers. "Your mother is remarkable," he said. "She is terrifying is what she is." "Also that." He was quiet for a moment. "She asked me directly whether I was good for you. I don't think people have ever asked me that before. Usually they ask whether I'm dangerous, or whether I'm profitable, or whether I'm—" He stopped. "But that's not the same question." "No," Caterina said. "What did you tell her?" "I told her I intended to be." She looked at him. He was looking straight ahead, at the street in front of them, but she could see the set of his jaw, the particular quality of determination that was so much a part of him. "That's a good answer," she said. "It's an honest one." He turned to look at her. "I'm not going to make you promises I'm not certain I can keep. I've watched people do that and seen what it costs." He paused. "What I can promise is what I intend." "Intending is enough to start with," she said. He stopped walking. She stopped too, and turned, and he was looking at her in the way he'd looked at her that first evening she'd gone out to his table and found him holding a glass of her father's Barolo and looking at it like it was telling him something. He kissed her. It was, like everything about him, not tentative. It was deliberate and unhurried and warm. One hand curved along her jaw, and it tasted like Rosa's wine and winter air. She kissed him back. Mulberry Street went about its December business around them, a couple walking a dog, someone's exhaust turning white in the cold, and they stood on the sidewalk and the city held them in its ordinary, extraordinary way. When they stepped apart, he kept his hand at her jaw for a moment longer, looking at her. "Come upstairs," she said. He looked at her. "I live on Prince Street," she said. "I have better wine than my mother." "I don't doubt it," he said. They walked. He had a way of taking up a room that she had thought would feel overwhelming in her apartment, the place that was entirely hers, the small rooms on the third floor of the Prince Street building, with its particular arrangement of books and plants and the cluttered kitchen and the photograph of her father on the windowsill. It didn't feel overwhelming. He moved through it with the same consideration he moved through everything, looking at things without touching them, reading the room the way he read everything, the books on the shelves, the dishes she had from her grandmother, the way she had arranged the kitchen. She watched him from the doorway with the wine she'd opened and thought, "He is trying to understand me. He does this everywhere." "Your father," he said. He was looking at the photograph on the windowsill. It was the one she loved best, her father in the kitchen, mid-service, laughing at something, his apron on, the look of a man entirely at home. "Yes. He looks happy." "He was happy," she said. "That was one of his gifts. He was constitutionally happy in a way that some people are, and it made everyone around him happy, and I've spent 3 years trying to—" She stopped. "Trying to carry that forward." "You have," he said. He turned from the photograph to look at her. "I've sat in that room. I've watched those people. That happiness is still in the walls." She handed him the wine. They sat on the small sofa. Her apartment didn't run to spacious furniture, and the city hummed outside the window, the particular December frequency of it, and they were close in the way that small spaces enforce, and neither of them moved away from. He told her things. Not the big things, not the shape and substance of the life she understood ran parallel to the one she could see, but smaller things, the things people tell each other when they are beginning to trust. He told her about the apartment in Carroll Gardens where he'd grown up, which looked nothing like the penthouse on the Upper East Side he lived in now. He told her about a trip he'd taken to Sicily when he was 20, The only time he'd been to Italy, standing on a cliff above the sea, thinking that somewhere across this water was where his family came from. She told him about her father. She talked about him for a long time, the Sunday mornings in the kitchen, the way he had of teaching without quite teaching, the way she'd learned to read a room from watching him work a dining room. The last conversation they'd had, which had been about nothing in particular, just Tuesday afternoon nothing. And she'd been grateful for years that the last thing they'd said to each other was ordinary. He listened. He was a man who could listen without filling the space, which was rarer than it should have been. Later, much later, when the wine was done and the street outside was quiet, he looked at her and said, "I should go." "You should," she agreed. Neither of them moved. "Katerina," he said. "I know," she said. He kissed her again, different this time, slower, with the particular attentiveness of a person who knows they are learning something they want to remember exactly. When he left, she sat in the quiet of her apartment for a long time before sleeping, holding the feeling of the evening carefully, like something fragile. December built around them. The restaurant was the busiest time of year. Holiday parties, family dinners, the neighborhood gathering itself together against the cold and the dark. And Katerina was in the kitchen 11 hours a day and loving it, the particular joy of a restaurant in its season. He came. Not every day. He had a life, a complicated one, and there were stretches of days when she didn't see him and heard from him only in brief messages, sometimes just a single sentence at odd hours that she began to look forward to with an embarrassing consistency. "The branzino tonight reminded me of yours. The architect sent the revised drawings. The kitchen is exactly right. Are you awake?" That last one, at 1 a.m. on a Wednesday, and she had been awake, and she'd written back, yes, and he'd called her, and they'd talked until nearly 3, about nothing, really. The city, the neighborhood, a story he told about something that had happened at a meeting that afternoon that was, stripped of context, genuinely funny. She'd fallen asleep with the phone on the pillow and woken at 6 to find he'd texted, "Sleep well." She stared at that for a while in the blue morning. She was falling in love with Nero Falcone, and the thing that surprised her most was not how complicated that was, but how natural. The peace lasted until the 3rd week of December, which was when Marco Vitelli came to the restaurant. She didn't know who he was when he arrived. A man in his 50s, well-dressed, with the particular ease of someone who has never in their life had to think about money or whether they were welcome in a room. He came in without a reservation, asked for a table, was told there were none available, and then asked for the owner. Gianni came to find her in the kitchen. "He says he's an old friend of your father's," Gianni said. His voice was neutral in the particular way it got when he was concerned but didn't want to show it. She came out. Marco Vitelli stood at the bar with the easy patience of someone accustomed to being waited for. He smiled when he saw her, a warm smile, the practiced warmth of someone who has used charm as a tool for a very long time. "Katerina Bellini," he said. "The last time I saw you, you were about 12 years old, doing homework at the corner table." She looked at him. The name arrived in her memory, Vitelli. Her father had mentioned him occasionally, not warmly, but with the neutral tone he used for people he had complicated feelings about. Old money, old connections. "Mr. Vitelli," she said. "Please, Marco." He gestured around the restaurant. "Beautiful place. Your father would be so proud." "Thank you. What can I do for you?" He accepted her briskness without offense. "I heard you've been having some interesting conversations about the building, about the lease." She looked at him steadily. "Where did you hear that?" "Little Italy is a small neighborhood, even now." He smiled. "I also have friends in common with the Riva family." There it was. "You have a seat at the bar if you'd like a drink," she said. "The tables are full." "I don't need a table. I need 5 minutes." He leaned slightly toward her, lowering his voice. "The Rivas are serious about this block. They have a competing offer for the Falcone building that is significantly above market. If that offer closes, and it may, your 10-year lease is worth the paper it's printed on, no more." "Falcone Holdings owns the building," she said. "Falcone Holdings is under legal scrutiny regarding the acquisition. You may have heard." He said it with the smoothness of someone delivering information they know is a weapon. If the acquisition is successfully challenged, the building reverts to a disputed status and your lease becomes complicated. She held his gaze. Why are you telling me this? Because I'm in a position to facilitate an agreement with the Rivas that includes a long-term lease for Bellini's at terms very similar to what Falcone offered. The restaurant stays. The gravy continues. He smiled. And you extract yourself from a relationship with a man who, with respect, brings problems wherever he goes. She was quiet. The dining room was full and warm around them, and she could hear Marco in the kitchen and Gianni doing the table check and the sound of a table laughing at something. "Good night, Mr. Vitelli," she said. "Caterina, thank you for coming. The bar is available if you'd like a drink before you leave." She turned. "Gianni will take care of you." She went back to the kitchen. She called Nero at 11 that night, after service, sitting in the closed restaurant with a glass of wine and the receipts she'd been too distracted to finish. He answered immediately. "What's wrong?" She'd barely said his name. "Marco Vitelli came to the restaurant tonight," she said. A silence. Then, very carefully, "What did he say?" She told him. Everything, precisely, in order. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, there was a silence that had a particular quality, not emptiness, but the quality of a room where a decision is being made. "The legal challenge to the acquisition," she said. "Is it real?" "It's being attempted," he said. "It is not going to succeed." "How certain are you?" "Completely." His voice was very level. "Vitelli is a messenger. He's carrying someone else's strategy. What he told you was designed to make you doubt the lease and doubt me, in that order." A pause. "Do you?" She looked at her wine glass. "Tell me honestly," she said, "is there anything about the acquisition that could be used to unwind it?" "There are things about the acquisition that, framed a particular way, could be made to look problematic. Yes." He said it directly. "Those things will not be framed that way, because the people who could frame them have been persuaded not to." Persuaded. She held that word. "Nero," she said. "I know what you're asking." His voice was quiet. "I'm not going to lie to you. This is what my world looks like. I've told you that. I've never hidden it." "No," she said. "You haven't. Does it change things?" She sat in her father's restaurant, in the warm dark of it, with the receipts on the bar and the chairs up on the tables and the smell of the evening still in the walls. "No," she said, "it doesn't change things. But I want you to know that I'm not someone you need to manage or protect from information. I'm someone you can tell the truth to." "That's why I answered the phone at 11 o'clock, he said, with a quietness that meant more than quietness usually did. She breathed. "Come on Sunday," she said. "I'll make the artichokes." "Sunday," he said. The renovation began on January 3rd. Caterina had negotiated a 60-day closure from January 1st through the end of February, during which the building would undergo the structural work, the kitchen expansion, the new dining room layout. She'd use the time to plan the reopening, to source new equipment, to refine the menu that would carry forward her father's legacy into the new space. She'd also spent the first week of January doing nothing at all, which was the first time she'd done that since her father died. Nero had asked where she wanted to go. She'd said Salerno. They flew to Naples and drove down the Amalfi Coast in a rented car, her insistence on the rental. She'd said she wanted to drive, and she had, while he sat in the passenger seat with the particular ease of someone who is not accustomed to being driven and is choosing to be fine with it. Salerno in January was cold and gray and beautiful, the old city rising up from the harbor with the specific dignity of places that have been themselves for a very long time. They stayed in a small hotel in the historic center, nothing like what she imagined he was accustomed to, and he said nothing about it and seemed, she thought, genuinely unbothered. She found the street her father had grown up on. She'd had the address from his papers. Her mother had kept everything, and they walked it on the second morning, in the salt wind coming off the sea, and she stood in front of a building that looked much as it must have looked when her father was a boy, and felt the strange vertigo of being in the origin story of someone you love. Nero stood beside her and said nothing, which was exactly right. "He would have liked you," she said, "under different circumstances." What circumstances would have been different? If you'd come to the restaurant as a customer and not as the man trying to buy the building, she smiled slightly. He didn't have much patience for the other things, but he could see what was real in people. That was his gift. What does he see when he looks at me? Nero said. He said it in the present tense, which she noticed, which she loved him for. She turned to look at him. The wind moved his hair. He looked, in this gray January street in the city his grandmother had come from, slightly undone from the version of himself he wore in New York. Not less himself, but more openly himself, as if distance from the life he maintained there had loosened something. He sees a man who is trying to be more than what he was made to be, she said. He held her gaze. The thing in his face, that deep, careful attention, shifted into something warmer, something she was still learning the name of. Is that what you see? He said. That's what I see, she said. He took her hand. She held it. They stood in her father's street and let the wind move around them. On the last day, they went to find the address Nero had for his grandmother's home, a number in the Orto Botanico district, high on the hill above the city. The building had been converted to apartments. The neighborhood had changed, as all neighborhoods change. But the view was there. The harbor below, the Gulf of Salerno, the mountains behind. She watched him stand at the edge of the view, looking out at the water. He was very still. She used to describe this, he said. The water. She said it was so blue in summer that you thought it was painted. She said you couldn't believe a color could be that real. It probably is that blue, Katerina said. In summer. I know. He turned from the view to look at her. I'm going to come back in summer. She looked at him. With you, he said. She held his gaze. You're very certain about things, she said. About this, he said. Yes. She thought about certainty, about the kind that was stubbornness and the kind that was faith, about her father, who had been certain that his Sunday gravy would matter to people, and had been right, about her own certainty, the one she had been moving toward since October, that this man who had walked into her restaurant with an eviction letter and eaten her father's gravy was one of the realest things she'd found in years. In summer, she said. He smiled. The real one, the full one, the one she'd been working to earn since October. She thought she might be looking at it for a very long time. The new Bellinis opened on March 1st. She had planned for weeks and cooked for days. Trial runs in the new kitchen, which was everything the architect's plans had promised and more, with its doubled prep space and its updated equipment and its ventilation system that actually worked. The kitchen smelled the way it should, of possibility and heat, and she stood in it on the morning of the soft opening and felt her father in every corner of it. The dining room was the same and different. The corner entrance worked exactly as Nero had said it would, pulling light in from two directions. The table spacing was generous without feeling empty. The pendant lamps, her father's lamps, salvaged and rewired, hung over the same red-clothed tables, which were the same tables which she had insisted on, and the contractor had thought she was being impractical and had been wrong. It looked like Bellini's. It felt like Bellini's. It was just more of itself. Gianni came in at 9 and stood in the middle of the dining room and turned slowly, taking it in. Good, he said. That was Gianni's highest register of approval. Marco, the sous chef, came in at 10, walked through the kitchen, said nothing for 2 minutes, and then said, "The 6-burner is a revelation," which for Marco was practically lyrical. Her mother came at noon and cried, briefly and without apology, and then put her apron on and asked what needed doing. Nero came in the evening, before service. She was in the kitchen when Gianni told her. She knew from his face, the careful neutrality of it, that it was him, and she took off her apron and went out. He was standing in the middle of the dining room, just standing, not at a table, not at the bar, in the middle of the room, looking at it. She came and stood beside him. He looked at her. His face had the thing in it she'd first seen in October, that night when he'd come back for the first time with no reservation, the thing that was the closest she had a word for to undone, but more so, older. "It's still here," he said. "It was always going to still be here," she said. "It just needed a little more room." He put his arm around her. There it was, Not calculated, not careful, just his arm around her shoulders, pulling her against his side in the specific way of people who have crossed some threshold past which performance isn't necessary. "Your father would approve," he said. "He would have things to say about the pendant lamp placement," she said. "He always said slightly to the left." She looked up. "But yes, he would approve." Gianni was watching from the edge of the dining room with an expression that, for once, was not neutral at all. She pretended not to see. The opening service was full, completely, impossibly full, with a waiting list and a line at the door that Gianni managed with his particular combination of warmth and ironclad structure. Every table turned twice. The kitchen ran smoothly, in the way that well-designed kitchens run. Not without pressure, but with competent pressure, the kind that makes good food rather than frantic food. She sent the Sunday gravy. She sent the bruschetta with the winter tomatoes. She sent the carbonara and the branzino and the stuffed artichokes, and Marco's cacio e pepe, which had become the dish people talked about when they talked about Bellinis. Old Mr. Giannotti was at his table by the window. He had dressed up, a jacket and tie she hadn't seen before, somewhat grand for the occasion, which moved her considerably. When she came out to greet him at the end of service, he took her hands in both of his and looked at her with the clear eyes of an old man who has seen many things. "Your father," he said. "Yes," she said. "He would be so pleased." She squeezed his hands. "I know he would." When she looked up, Nero was at the bar, watching her. He raised his glass slightly. Not a toast, just an acknowledgement. She held his gaze. This, she thought, this is what endures. Spring came to Little Italy in the particular way it always did, not with fanfare, but with increments, the light lasting longer each day, the street vendors reappearing, the particular quality of the air shifting from the closed-in cold of winter to something opening. The restaurant found its rhythm in the new space. The Sunday gravy was the anchor it had always been. The kitchen worked the way a good kitchen works, with the quality of a well-made thing, the components fitting together without strain. She and Nero found their rhythm too. He came on Sunday mornings still, for the gravy. He was good at it now, genuinely good. Not as good as she was, but that was years away, and she told him so, and he received this assessment with a characteristic lack of defensiveness, and said, "Then I'll keep coming on Sundays." And she'd said, "Yes, you will." He came on other evenings too. He came to the restaurant and sat at the bar or at table 7 and ate and watched the room with the proprietary warmth of someone who has come to understand why a place matters. He came to her apartment and learned the particular vocabulary of it, where the good wine glasses were, which window let in the best morning light, how she liked her coffee. She came, sometimes, to his penthouse on the Upper East Side, which was everything she expected it to be. Spare, deliberate, the architecture earning its space, a view of the park that was genuinely extraordinary. She noted the books on the shelves, which were not decorative, and the way the kitchen had been designed by someone who understood cooking, and the single photograph in the living room, which was old and slightly faded, and showed a woman she recognized from other photographs she'd seen. His grandmother, in front of a harbor that might be Salerno, squinting into the sun, laughing. She didn't comment on it. She didn't need to. The Riva situation resolved in the way such things resolve when the people behind them decide the cost exceeds the return. She didn't ask for details. She knew they had been persuaded to redirect their attention, and she knew what persuasion in Nero's world looked like, and she held that knowledge in the same compartment where she held everything else she'd decided to know and accept and not build her life around interrogating. Sal came around. It took 2 months and a Sunday dinner at her mother's, at which Nero showed up with a bottle of wine he'd been told not to bring. He'd asked her specifically what wine her uncle liked, which was how she knew he'd ignored the instruction deliberately and as a form of respect, and sat across from Sal for 3 hours while Sal tested him with questions that were sometimes direct and sometimes oblique and sometimes just the particular challenge of a man who looks at someone over a dinner table and decides what they're made of. At the end of the evening, when Nero and Caterina were at the door, Sal had shaken Nero's hand with a grip that said several things at once, and then said, in the plainest voice he had, "She's the best of us. You understand what that means." "I do," Nero had said. "Good," Sal had said. And that was that. One evening in April, warm enough now to open the restaurant's new window panels, the street air coming in with the smell of spring. She was closing down the kitchen when Nero appeared at the back door. He looked, she noted, like himself, which was to say composed and precise. But there was something in his face, a particular quality of presence, that she'd learned to read. Something had happened. She poured 2 glasses of wine. She sat at the prep counter. She waited. "There was a problem tonight," he said, "in the other part of my work." "Are you all right?" "Yes," he held her gaze. "Others aren't." She was quiet. "I want you to know what you're choosing," he said. "I want you to choose it with full information, not the version that makes it easier." She looked at him across the counter, this man who had been in her kitchen every Sunday for 6 months, who had stood in her father's street in Salerno and looked at the water, who had eaten her grandmother's stuffed artichokes and said, "This is extraordinary," and meant it, who ran a machinery she couldn't see and wouldn't ask about, and which was real. "I know what I'm choosing," she said. "Katerina." "Nero." She held his gaze. "I'm not choosing a version of you. I'm choosing you. That includes the parts I don't ask about." She paused. "What I need is that you're honest with me when it matters, that you don't manage me, that you don't decide what I can handle." "I'm here," he said, "because I decided you could handle it." She held that. "Then we're fine," she said. He looked at her for a long time. Something in his face, the thing that had been building since the first Sunday morning, the first glass of Barolo at the bar, the first time she'd stood close enough to feel the warmth of him at the stove, settled into something she didn't have a precise word for. Something like peace, if peace was possible for a man like him. She reached across the counter. He took her hand. The kitchen was warm and smelled of the evening's service, and the spring was outside the window, and the restaurant was all around them, holding them in it the way good places hold the people who have loved in them. "Come home," she said. He did. The feast of San Gennaro came around again in September, and Mulberry Street became itself in the way it always became itself for those days. The lights strung between buildings, the tables in the street, the smell of zeppole, the particular sound of the neighborhood gathered around its own celebration. Bellini's set up its tables outside, as it had every year, the Sunday gravy, the bruschetta with the summer tomatoes from the upstate farm, which were at their peak and were, this year, particularly extraordinary, the stuffed artichokes, the arancini that Lucia had perfected over the year and which people specifically asked about now, which made her stand slightly straighter when she carried the trays. Old Mr. Gennady was at his outside table in the September evening light, with his family around him, his daughter, his grandchildren, the generational gathering that the feast always produced. He was eating the Sunday gravy with the focused pleasure of a man who still, after all these years, takes the things that are good seriously. Katerina moved between the tables and the kitchen with the ease of someone who knows exactly where they are and exactly what they're doing. The new kitchen behind her, the old lamps above her, the street alive in front of her. She caught Gianni's eye across the dining room, and he gave her the look that meant service is perfect. And she gave him the look that meant, I know. Her mother was there, at a table with Sal and his wife and 2 of Sal's children, who were in their 20s and had come because they always came. Rosa was in the middle of a story that had everyone at the table leaning forward, which was Rosa's natural state. Nero arrived at 7. He came from the direction of Spring Street. She saw him from across the street, moving through the feast crowd with the contained ease of someone who has learned to move through crowds without pushing. And he was carrying 2 bottles of wine, which she was reasonably certain she had not told him to bring, which meant he had asked her mother, who had apparently told him what to bring, which meant there had been a conversation between Nero and her mother that she did not know about. She was going to be fine with this. He found her at the service table and set the wine down and looked at her the way he always looked at her, the full attention look, the one that still, after 8 months, made her aware of herself in a way that was not uncomfortable, but was definite. "You told her not to tell me," she said. "I didn't tell her not to tell you," he said. "I simply didn't tell her to tell you." "That's a distinction without a difference." "It's a distinction that saved me the argument." His mouth curved. She took the wine. She looked at the label, which was significant. A Taurasi from a small producer in Campania that she happened to know very well, because it was the wine her father had always ordered for special occasions, and it was not a wine you found easily. "Where did you find this?" she said. "I asked your Uncle Sal. He said it with the particular neutrality of someone who is pleased with a solution and choosing not to make too much of it." She looked at him, at this man who had found her father's wine, and asked her uncle, who had once left a specific message at his office, and who now stood in the middle of the feast of San Gennaro, in a neighborhood that was, in every way that mattered, also now his. "Come," she said. She handed the wine to Gianni, who took it with the expression of someone who is cataloging a development, and she took Nero's hand and pulled him toward the music. The trio was playing the same slow song they'd been playing for 30 years, the same song they'd played last November when she'd asked him to dance in the street. The couples were gathering in the space in front of the musicians, moving in the easy way of people who have done this before, who know how to hold on to something without gripping. He didn't wait for her to ask. He took her hand, his other hand settled at her waist, and they moved into the music. It was different from last November. The same song, but everything different. The way a piece of music is different the 50th time you hear it from the first, layered now with all the times between, all the Sunday mornings and late-night phone calls, and Salerno in January, and the opening night with her father's lamps and Rose's lamb and Sal's handshake, and the ordinary, extraordinary accumulation of a life being built. "Next September," he said, close to her ear. "What about it?" "I want to come back here, with you, to this." She tilted her head back to look at him. "You're planning a year ahead." "I plan further than that," he said, "for things that matter." She looked at him. The feast lights were above them, the music was around them, the street smelled of Zeppeli and September, and somewhere in the building behind her was the kitchen where her father had learned to make the Sunday gravy before he brought it to New York, and somewhere in this neighborhood was the apartment where she had grown up, and somewhere above them was the sign that said Bellini's in the letters she had replaced 2 months ago, a little larger than before, a little more visible from the corner. "Then plan it," she said. He looked at her. "Plan as far ahead as you want," she said. "I'll be here." He held her gaze. The full attention look. The one that cost him something every time he let her see it. And that he let her see anyway, because somewhere between October and now, he had decided she was worth the cost of being seen. "I know," he said. They danced. Mulberry Street held them. The neighborhood held them. This neighborhood of 300 years of people arriving with nothing and building something, of families and feuds and Sunday gravies and slow-burning loves and ordinary meals that were actually extraordinary, and the particular stubborn endurance of places that decide to remain themselves against every force that tries to change them. The music played. Caterina Bellini danced with the man who had come to evict her father's restaurant, and had instead, in the slow, inevitable way of things that are meant, become part of it. Above them, the sign said Bellini's. It would say Bellini's for a very long time. Years later, many years if you count them, and even more if you measure them in Sunday mornings, a boy of about 7 would sit at the kitchen counter of Bellini's restaurant, doing his homework with the absolute confidence of a child who has been doing this all his life, while around him, the prep work for the dinner service hummed its familiar rhythm. He had his mother's dark hair and his father's gray eyes, and the particular quality of attention that people who watched him carefully recognized as something inherited, something old in the blood. When the Sunday gravy was ready, he would be given the first bowl, as he always was. He would eat it the way he had eaten it since he was old enough to eat it, with the seriousness it deserved. And sometimes, when his father thought no one was watching, he would stand at the doorway of the kitchen and look at his mother at the stove, and the look on his face would be the most unguarded thing about him, which is saying a great deal, because he was not a man given to leaving himself uncovered. And his mother would turn from the stove, as she always did at the exact right moment, as if she'd always known he was there, and she would meet his eyes, and something would pass between them that had no name but didn't need one. The gravy murmured in the pot. The restaurant held its breath. Mulberry Street went on. For every woman who fell for the wrong man in the right moment, for every man who found himself, for every meal that mattered,